Appreciate that. So I want to take a moment before I begin my talk to first of all commend your Historical Society for adapting your programming this year. I know a lot of organizations have done this, and I'm very impressed with the historical societies across Ontario doing this. It's been definitely a challenging year for all of us to adapt our programming. So keep up the good work. And I always want to tell you to keep up pressure on elected officials to keep funding our historical societies and museums here in Ontario as well. So if they don't hear from you, they're not going to fund you. So we've been doing a lot of work. I'm a part of the Ontario Museum Association. So continue your efforts to promote what you're doing in your community. For those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian Automotive Museum, we are located in downtown Oshawa. We've been there since 1963, and we're an independent not-for-profit charity. And we've probably told the Canadian story of the automobile for over 55 years. Oshawa is home to the Automotive Museum because it's, we feel, the center of the Canadian automotive industry. We don't listen to anything they say in Windsor about that. We just say Oshawa is the center of the automotive industry. And that's because we've been home to General Motors, and previously to that, the McLaughlin Carriage Works and McLaughlin Motor Car Company. And we've been producing automobiles in Oshawa since 1907. So we have a long history here in Ontario of producing those automobiles. If you haven't been to the museum recently, I definitely invite you to come by whenever we're able to reopen. So we're hoping, I keep saying later this spring, but we're waiting for those numbers to come down a little bit more and for more of our volunteers to get vaccinated as well. So I'll definitely can keep you posted on that. Now, some of these slides are a little pre-COVID, so bear with me that we used to have fun, exciting programs, and we will soon enough again once we get back to normal. But we've have a lot, both pre and current COVID programming I want to share with you. We offer all sorts of programs related to automobiles for different knowledge levels as well. We focus particularly on Canadian cars. So one example I just wanted to show on the screen is a 1975 Bricklin, the Bricklin being a particularly fun Canadian example as a sports car built in 74, 75 out in New Brunswick. You can also see a picture of our main gallery here as well with Lightning McQueen, the star of Disney's Cars 3 movie, which we have on display for children at the moment, and some of our volunteers there as well. So we have lots of different programs. We also have downtown walking tours. So we've been transitioning to, COVID-friendly events that don't involve a lot of people being in the gallery. So we've been doing a lot of online talks, just like you guys are doing. We also have downtown walking tours we're doing throughout the summer. So I'm sure you guys do walking tours of Richmond Hill. And so we do downtown walking tours of Oshawa, looking at particularly the automotive heritage sites. So where the carriage works were, where the first cars were built. Unfortunately for Oshawa, most of the early heritage sites related to the auto industry have been demolished and replaced by other buildings. So we really enjoy taking people around to the area around the museum so they can really get an idea of what this sort of industrial community was and where it sort of grew out of compared to the current automotive manufacturing plants that exist today. We also have great family fun days, guest speakers, and the one at the bottom is one of my favorites, something I never thought of before I got into this organization, is paranormal investigations, which prior to COVID were a huge hit. So that picture, it's a little hard to see what he's doing, but that's actually a psychic medium, and he is investigating if you can get any spirits related to that big Dodge Regent. So apparently ghosts can be connected to cars. Take it as you will, but we sell a lot of tickets for these sort of explorations of spirits related to automobiles. They're quite fun and interesting events throughout the year. So we hope to, you can't really do that over Zoom. It's not as fun, but we hope to get those back as well soon enough. One other project I wanted to bring up briefly that we've been doing over the last year is we've been really working on our library. So we're home to the Glenn Beckler Canadian Automotive Research Library, or the CAR Library, as we like to call it. This is part of the museum that's really come alive in the last couple of years through a number of federal grants. We're the home of the largest collection of Canadian automotive literature, basically in the world. And so we have about 7,000 car brochures, about 16,000 magazines. So we have quite a large collection, books, advertisements, and so on. And so that's something we really prioritized during the lockdown in terms of our staff and volunteer time. And we're hoping to make that more accessible to the public in the next couple of years. So if you're interested in researching Canadian cars, definitely reach out to us. Oops, sorry. There we go. So this evening, I'm going to explore some basically fun car facts with you. When it comes to automobiles, we could definitely talk for hours and hours and hours, and I've been known to do that, but I'll keep it kind of to the point in terms of some of the fun facts that I've learned over the past 7 years or so working as a car curator. And I'll focus a bit on Canada's relationship with automobiles, and particularly comparing the early 20th century to the early 21st century. We'll talk about the dream, the reality, our fear and fascination with the automobile. Sorry, getting a pop-up here on my screen. I'll just get rid of that. There we go. So in terms of the automobile, over the last 100 and 120 years or so, the technology and our social constructs have really changed. But I always like to argue that our concerns about things like personal safety and control when it comes to driving in automobiles really has not. I personally enjoy this topic because it's something that we're all sort of familiar with. And it seems like everyone has an opinion on everything from electric cars to the role that cars play in our lives, to automation, to self-driving cars these days. So it's something that all groups can really join in with in terms of that discussion. And it's not highly technical or a highly obscure historical topic. And it can definitely be something that people are quite passionate about. So driverless technology, electric cars, global climate change, definitely all hot button topics, and something that we like to think of as sort of a 21st century discussion, but also going back even to the late 1890s, early 1900s, similar conversations were being had by our predecessors. So to begin with, what exactly is an automobile? It seems like sort of a funny thing to think about here in 2021, but it's something that our ancestors definitely would have discussed back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, the automobile in Canada is basically a marriage of late 19th century's technologies. But when it comes down to it, it's really a horseless carriage. So prior to the age of the automobile, you would have the carriage industry, and you'd have your 1 or 2 horsepower, obviously, vehicles, because they had 1 or 2 horses leading them around Richmond Hill or other communities. Now, the basic concept of a 4-wheeled animal pulled transport vehicle really has been around for a long time, thousands of years. In fact, I think we've all seen those, Moses and these movies. You see the ancient Egyptians or Romans in their chariots. So this has been figured out for thousands of years. But the automobile itself is a much more recent in terms of its technology, obviously. And one of the things I always like to point out when I'm talking about early automobiles is I think it gets lost exactly how diverse the world of the horse and carriage really was back in the late 19th century. So I'm sure many of you as Historical Society members have been to Victorian homes. And so you go into Victorian homes, they have, lavish wallpaper and sort of over the top upholstery on things. But then when you look at photos, it seems like everyone's wearing black and white and all their carriages are black as well. And this certainly wasn't the case. The world of the late 19th century, kind of late Victorian world here in Upper Canada really was quite a diverse one in terms of the range of carriages and colors that they came in and upholstery and so forth that you had in this world. And so here I have an example of one carriage we have in our collection that was owned by the McLaughlins. I'm sure someone off the top of their head could tell me the local carriage maker in the Richmond Hill area, but in Oshawa, it was definitely the McLaughlin Carriage Works was the largest and would go on to actually be the largest in the British Empire by the early 20th century. Here we have an advertisement for the McLaughlin Carriage Works from 1897. You can just, get a hint of the different types of carriages. And so the people buying these carriages were quite smart consumers. So they compared prices, they compared styles, and there's a lot of variation to what a carriage could be to your family. And so when we get into automobiles, that's going to transition over to styles, to different sizes to, 2-person, 4-person, depending on what you're looking, how much storage space you need in your early automobile versus your carriage. All those types of things are going to come into the automotive world. And I was looking at your Facebook page today, so I just wanted to use an example from Richmond Hill, and you can tell me this is all incorrect information, but as far as I could tell from the Richmond Hill Public Library, this is one of the earliest automobiles in your region, which I'm glad to use because I'm familiar with one of these. This is a 1902 Oldsmobile Curved Dash with a great name because it has a curved dashboard, so that wooden part just has a nice curve there in front. So it's very similar to a lot of other automobiles that you'd find in the late 1890s, early 1900s. A few kind of quick facts. The first combustion engine vehicle was built by George Foot Foss in Canada, in Sherbrooke, Quebec in 1897. His grandson was one of our speakers recently. That original vehicle is no longer in existence, but his grandson is actually building a tribute vehicle based on photos and based on descriptions of that first car. So it's been somewhat similar to this vehicle in terms of size and shape and so forth that you see from Dr. Langstaff's car just a few years later that would have been imported from the States. So the first car is in 1897. Around 1898, a number of cars are starting to be imported from the States, but that's really the beginning of the auto industry here in Canada. The first major company that you probably would have heard of is going to be Ford Motor Company. Is going to move production and start production in 1904 in what we now know as Windsor, which would have been Ford Canada back at the time. So you can sort of see from this 1902 Oldsmobile Curved Dash kind of what the beginnings of the automobile are and how it sort of relates to that early carriage era. So you can imagine if your engine broke on this, you could just hook it up to a horse and away you go. The engine is actually underneath the vehicle. So normally with cars, up until the present day, the engine's going to be out front. So the engine's underneath, and guess is where the gas tank are. The gas tank is usually right under the seat. So in order to fill this with gasoline or kerosene or whatever really you had available that was combustible, you would pop the seat off, and that's how you actually fill the gas into the gas tank. And the reason for this is because you need gravity in order for that gasoline. There's no fuel pump yet. So the gas tank always had to be above the engine because the gas would have to flow down into the engine. And so that's why in early cars, that engine is going to be below the car. And then later on, you'll notice in other photos, if you have the engine up higher, the seat goes up higher as well, just for that little piece of gravity that you're going to always be fighting against. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the intersection of the carriage world and the automobile. And we have several great calendar images. These are from Parkwood Estate, the McLaughlin Estate in Oshawa. And I absolutely love using them because I think they really sum up sort of the intersection of the two worlds. And so this is a calendar image from around 1904 from the McLaughlin Carriage Company. So the McLaughlin Carriage Company is clearly interested in selling carriages and the dream of the carriage. And I think these also show that our ancestors in the early 20th century also had quite a sense of humor about the world they lived in. They weren't as stodgy as sometimes I think we make people out to be 120 years ago. So here we have clearly a realistic representation of what one do with their horse and carriage. So we have a gentleman with quite a nice mustache. So maybe that's one of Kevin's relatives, I guess. Everyone in Richmond Hill, Oshawa, has a great mustache like that. And he has 3 ladies and his golf clubs. So how many times do you think, oh, I need a big car because I'm going to need all my golf clubs? Well, even in the horse and carriage days, you need to take your golf clubs and 3 ladies to the golf course with you. So I don't know which one of them was going golfing, so you can kind of read into that. But at the bottom, you can see the McLaughlin signature slogan, "One grade only, and that the best." And so that was the slogan that sold tens of thousands of carriages throughout the British Empire. And so here we have an idyllic situation, no automobiles in sight. But then the next year, the automobile makes its horrid appearance on the streets of Ontario. And so what's the lesson to be learned here? Well, clearly, if you want to keep your lady you're going to want to keep your horse and carriage. So what are some great examples of the downside to those awful automobiles that are coming into the market? Well, up at the top right, obviously the ladies are quite unhappy because they have to change a tire or whatnot. But even worse, look at these guys. They ended up going right off the bridge into that river, you know, spitting water out. I don't even know what happened to this guy. He must be talking to the doctor. But he's kept up with a whole bunch of 2x4s, it looks like, and just very unfortunate. So the best way to avoid this situation is to have a very nice McLaughlin one-horse carriage. You can see properly riding past. They're not offering to help. They're just gonna keep going. And you can see under the tire, if you can see it, that is exactly carriage number 185 if you want to order it directly from the catalog. But then the automobiles, they get even a little bit larger, a little bit scarier. And so then the question for the consumer is, what exactly is going to happen if your carriage runs into an automobile one-on-one on the road? Well, obviously, as a carriage maker, your carriage is going to win. Probably not in reality, but the cars at this time were not very powerful. But this is, I find, a fascinating advertisement. So kind of a multi-scene picture that the two of them go by. Obviously, the ladies grab onto those nice gents, but they all end up in the ditch. And you're wondering, what does it say on the far right? Well, and they're of course laughing. So in the small print, she's waving at them in their misfortune and saying, guess they didn't know 'twas a McLaughlin. So people that bought McLaughlin carriages like to apparently gloat at others' misfortunes as well. Even the horses seem to be laughing at the automobile. But then there's a big change in the following year. And Sam McLaughlin is going to convince the family that they need to get into the manufacture of motor cars. And so they're going to have to suddenly have a different tune. And so the tune quickly changes with the McLaughlin family because the McLaughlins are going to produce both automobiles and cars starting in automobiles and carriages starting in 1907. And so instead of laughing at people's misfortune, here we have a great image of the car and the carriage meeting, and they're shaking hands very properly. So they've made their truce. And here I think it's a good example. You can see exactly how colorful and elaborate these vehicles, both the carriages and the cars, were around 1907. So quite gorgeous vehicles, great woodwork done on all of these, great paint, custom upholstery. But you can see the families are all out. The one thing we always laugh about is you can see that they all are quite bundled up for the dusty roads. So it doesn't really show you exactly how dirty early motoring was. So obviously there's a lot of dirt. The roads were not in very good condition anywhere in Ontario at this time. So you can see they have goggles, hats. The ladies have their hats tied on very, very tight. Those hats would have gone flying from the back of the automobile. But they've gotten into sharing the road. And then the last of our series, you can see a sort of a perfect end to the story. So instead of coming at each other from different sides, they're now wonderfully sharing the road here in Ontario, which is exactly how we are still in 2021. Horses and cars sharing the road. But again, you can see all that gear that the early automobile driver is wearing. So he has goggles, a hat, a full trench coat on. The ladies are quite covered up in front. She has her whole face covered with the veil from all that dirt that the other cars are gonna kick up. But a wonderful Saturday afternoon with the McLaughlin Carriage Company. Here's the first year of those McLaughlin automobiles, just to give you an idea of what they look like. This vehicle is currently on display in the museum. It's on loan from General Motors of Canada. And these are the first automobiles produced in Oshawa. So not the first ones produced in Canada, but this came off the line in, we believe, December 1907. So this is a 1908 model year. And from this, over 20 million vehicles have been produced in Oshawa since then. So this is actually an interesting car. I mentioned earlier that early automobiles have the engine underneath. So this car actually does still have an engine underneath the center of the vehicle. So you're wondering what exactly is up front if there's no engine? That's actually where the gas tank is. So sort of you look sort of in the center of what you would think of as the hood of the car. So there's at the front the radiator cap, but then sort of in the center, that's actually the gas cap for this vehicle. So the gas is actually up front, where we would, sort of intuitively assume there would be an engine, but the engine is actually underneath, basically underneath the center of the car for gravity and to equalize out the vehicle. So you actually can't pop the hood. There's nothing to see under there really. So that's actually bolted down at all times. So sort of an interesting vehicle. Sort of looks like something you'd assume would be similar to a layout we have nowadays, but very different in fact. So moving from there, let's get into some of the differences that we have and the changes that were gone through in the early 20th century. And I'd like to look at a few different pieces and parts of automobiles and sort of look at how, particularly here in Canada, automakers, kind of worked through the carriage era, through the automobile era, and they do it at a very high speed. So the evolution of the automobile here in Canada between 1900 and 1920 is really extreme compared to, say, if you have a Honda Accord from 2001 compared to 2021, it's basically going to be sort of the same size, shape. You really can drive one, drive the other. You might have a CD player, not have a CD player, have those little things. But the basic idea of the windshield, the wheels, the engine, 4 seats, that sort of thing really isn't going to change very much through the late 20th century into the early 21st century. But 120 years ago, things are going to be rapidly changing. And there's all sorts of ideas, and we have some great examples in the museum of different ideas that different regional manufacturers had. And unfortunately, they didn't tend to work out for various reasons. So here are 2 examples that we have in our collection. They're both around 1908, 1909. So very similar to that McLaughlin we just looked at, but these are both examples of high wheelers. And so high wheelers are a type of vehicle that really looks very similar to a horse and carriage. And the basic idea is that carriage makers are really good at making wheels. They're very good at making carriages. So all you really need to do to transition over from a carriage maker to an automaker is to add that engine and add controls for the engine, and basically away you go. So on the left, we have a 1908 Tudhope McIntyre, and on the right, we have a Kennedy. So both of these are examples of people who could make carriage bodies, but they ended up importing early engines into Canada. And so one of the reasons Canada never really got a really independent auto industry is it was always dependent on imported engines from the States. And so folks like McLaughlin's and Oshawa, they paired with Billy Durant and General Motors, which turned out to be a great partner to have. But others, like the Tudhopes, they partnered with the McIntyre Automobile Company, which I'm sure you've never heard of because it was not very successful. So the McIntyre company was out of Indiana. There was a lot of companies that supplied engines. By the 19-teens, there's hundreds of automakers in the United States exporting parts, engines, full vehicles. And so Canadian companies were partnering all sorts of foreign companies, particularly American companies, to get these parts. And when those American companies went under, so did their Canadian partners. So you can really see with these, they do really look like carriage builders had built them. With the one on the left, the Tudhope, again, you're gonna have that engine underneath, not very accessible. Early consumers are not gonna enjoy having an engine under the car because you can imagine back in that time period, if there's an issue, you're gonna have to crawl under that car and fix it on the side of the road. There's no CAA. With carriage wheels, you can't take extras with you. So compared to later on when you can carry extra tubes, extra tires with these wooden wheels, there's not much you can do if you have an accident. If one of them breaks, you're really stranded on the side of the road. So they weren't really great in terms of their design, and they were manufactured only for a few years here in Ontario until this design really, it was quite old fashioned almost as soon as they had done it. So by the 19-teens, you couldn't really imagine making one of these anymore. And so they're gonna have to move on to different types of wheels. So I won't get too far into this, but wooden wheels have all sorts of problems. One being that they dry out. Here in Ontario, we have quite extreme weather differences. So talking to colleagues in Europe, they really don't have problems with automobiles that we do here. So the temperature, the humidity, all these things that we deal with in Ontario, you know, if you have old wood furniture, it's something you're concerned about. If you have old wood tires, it's something you should be very concerned about because with the temperature and the humidity changes, that's going to shrink. And those tires, those wheels can quickly start to fall apart. And so with early wooden wheels, it was always recommended that when possible, you drive them through a stream. So in the early 20th century, when you're out for a ride in the countryside, you'd always make sure to keep those wheels nice and wet. Obviously, that is not a long-term solution, particularly as cars got faster and faster. Wooden wheels also will sort of shake apart at high speeds. The vibrations are not great on wood, so they had to move to something else. So eventually by the 1920s, and then post-war, we go into metal spoke discs, metal spoke wheels, and then into eventually when the technology, the metal technology comes around into steel disc wheels that we all have today. So we got away from that wood for safety and comfort reasons. Another thing, going back to that 1902 curve dash that you saw, is that it didn't have, one of the earliest cars in Richmond Hill did not have a steering wheel. So that was another thing that had to be invented. So we have examples of early steering wheels and also tiller steering. So the first cars had tiller steering, which is just you know, basically a rod that you control going left or right. Cars at this point weren't going very fast, so you're going along at a leisurely pace. You could certainly direct which way the car was going. But then very soon after, by the early 1900s, we're going to have steering wheels invented as well. And one of the questions I often get from visitors who are going through the museum is a lot of confusion about sort of left-hand versus right-hand drive. And it's something you can't quite figure out from our collection. We obviously have cars from the United Kingdom and from Europe on display. We have American cars, we have Canadian cars. But the Canadian cars don't really fit a specific pattern, you know, sort of pre-1915 in terms of left-hand and right-hand drive. Now, a lot of people were surprised to find out that there was no like international conference on which side of the road to drive on or which side of the road the steering wheel went on. It's generally believed that Henry Ford decided that he was going to have all of his cars be left-hand drive. And so with the popularity of the Model T and other models, Ford Motor Company in Canada was producing left-hand drive cars, and thus it sort of became the standard regulation. But you can see with our Kennedy, which I previously mentioned from 1909, so same year as the 1909 Model T, that's going to have right-hand drive. And that just happens to be because the people building it thought it was more convenient. Back in the era of horse and carriage, it didn't particularly matter which side of the road you were on. If you go back and watch, for example, those early videos you can find on YouTube of people in New York City around 1900, it's just really chaos. No one's really going that fast, but you see automobiles everywhere, horses and carriage, people walking everywhere. They didn't really, when people were going quite slow, it didn't really matter exactly where you were walking or where you're driving your horse. But by the I'd say mid-19 teens, sort of left-hand drive becomes standard here in Canada. Really, and for that time, really breaking from sort of the British norms of how they were going to go forward. So in terms of Canadian automotive history, that's one of our kind of early periods of joining, you know, the American opinion instead of the English version of how cars were going to be kind of laid out. So what about starting your car? This is another question we get a lot. People often see videos or movies that involve starting a car with a crank. There's a lot of glamour, it seems, to that in old movies. Of course, when you watch a movie, it always works the first time. This definitely didn't always happen the first time. Excuse me. We have lots of cars with crank start in our collection. I'd often ask, like, you can raise your hand if you've crank started a car before. I don't think anyone's quite of that age. I think we've moved past that generation now. So unless you're really a collector, it's not something you do very often. But the basic idea is that they didn't have electric starters until the 19 teens. And so in order to get a spark to start the combustion in your vehicle's engine, you had to get that crank going. We actually, on the right, have a Carter car. So Mr. Carter actually died, so the story goes, from from cranking a Cadillac, apparently, and the crank backfired and injured him, which led to an infection, which led to his death. And so his friend Charles Kettering, who was head engineer at Cadillac at the time, went ahead and invented the electric starter, which we all, in one form or another, still have in our cars today. We certainly can't buy a car with a crank. We do have seat in our collection. One of the funny things about the crank is it was something that early consumers were quite used to, they're familiar with. And speaking of worries with early cars, it's something that didn't really go away until, I would say, the 1930s. So really 20 years after the technology had really solidly been replaced and was irrelevant, people still didn't trust that the electric starters would work on their cars, and they still wanted that optional crank to come with. And so one of the funny cars that we have in our collection is actually a 1929 Hudson. This is a car that certainly no one would ever have had to crank start while they owned the vehicle. But when it came into the museum, there's actually quite a lot of hand wear on it. So you could tell, because it's a metal object, there's a lot of wear from people turning it over and over again. And it turned out that the former owner had never actually crank started his car in a functional manner, but when he retired, enjoyed going out and having coffee in his car still, sitting in it, and every morning, sort of his routine was to crank the car just for fun. And so it was something he kind of did in his retirement. So we still have that well-worn crank, but as far as we know, it was never actually really necessary in order to start the vehicle. Speaking of electrics, we have a number of electric and alternative energy vehicles in our collection, and these are something that are of high interest to visitors these days. Obviously, electric cars are again, very popular with the public and popular in the public's imagination as well. This is a 1919 Roush and Lang. These were actually imported into Canada. They're popular with wealthy women, in fact. The McLaughlins in Oshawa actually built them briefly around 1911, 1912. They imported the chassis and built some bodies. This unfortunately is not a McLaughlin body, but very similar to what would have been produced in Oshawa a few years earlier. This is one of my favorite cars in the collection because there's a lot of social history that goes with it. You saw in those earlier photos, earlier images of the ladies with their big hats on, the driving gloves and all of that. And so this car, it was particularly built for wealthier women to operate. It has tiller steering instead of a steering wheel. But you'll notice like the big glass windows, and those were for, and it's actually, I believe, the tallest car in our collection, and that's to accommodate those large hats. So if you've seen Titanic or a movie like that, you can imagine those big ostrich feathers and so forth that women's hats had on at the time. And so this car has this sort of goldfish bowl dome really on top of it that allows for those large hats. If you can see in the back, there's a little pink vase. There's a vase with pink flowers. Those were original as well. So all these cars came with that vase as well. There's one other interesting social fact about this car that I still can't really believe, but the front seat actually turns around. And so one of the, social issues you could run into while driving a car is that you might find yourself talking to the back of a lady's head, and one would never want to do that. And so the front seat was designed so you could swivel around, and actually the person in the back seat could take control of the driving and then have a face-to-face conversation with the person in the front seat. So you can imagine this is quite dangerous, and it was. We know that many of these cars were involved in accidents, and actually, if you go to, for example, the City of Toronto archives, you can find lots of examples of early electric cars running into things and ending up on the side of the road because they're just terribly unsafe to drive around. But quite a fun car. It basically runs on car batteries, take about 24 kind of modern batteries to run it. So it's equally divided between batteries in the front and the back. One of the reasons we aren't able to really operate this is it's quite an expense to get that many batteries, because as we know, batteries don't last forever. And so in order to get this to run, you need a lot of batteries, which is quite an expense. People that still run these cars often will update the system. There's much more efficient batteries and so forth to get them to run still, but quite a fun and interesting car. We also have an early hybrid in our collection. This is a 1914 Galt Gas Electric from Galt, Ontario, which is part of Cambridge. This is actually on loan to the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles at the moment. It's sort of a COVID hostage. We were supposed to have it back last year, but with the border closure and all sorts of other things, it's still on loan. So hopefully we'll have it back by the end of 2021 if all goes well. This is an early hybrid in terms of how the engine works. So basically the gasoline engine is going to charge an electric battery. And so the electric battery would then hold the charge, similar to a lot of how modern electric cars generally work as well, with the gasoline engine and so forth, renewing the power in the battery and allowing it to move to just electric power from there on out. So very neat car. We look forward to having that back again. And this is part of an exhibit actually on early hybrid vehicles in Los Angeles as well. Now, one thing we don't talk a lot about in the 21st century, we talk a lot about electric cars, hybrid cars, things that were around in the early 20th century. But the one thing that was around that no one's really interested in getting back into is steam cars. Now, for some reason, Tesla is not building steam cars. They're not investigating it, but steam cars were actually quite popular in the early 20th century. So here we have Canada's only example of a steam car company, which is a Brooks Steamer, which was built in Stratford around 1925, 1926. This is a bit of a long story, but needless to say, it was built in Stratford, and it was a bit of we're not quite sure how much of a con job it was, but there's lots of theories that the owners of this company really took the town to the bank in terms of the financing, and then ran off with the money. So the Brooks steam car was built in Stratford because Stratford at the time was really a terminus of a lot of steam locomotive repair shops. And so a lot of railway lines went through Stratford, so they had the steam technology and the know-how. And so the Brooks Steam Car Company was built there. A man named O.J. Brooks was in charge of it. Sold a lot of shares. So in our collection, we have quite a few examples of stock certificates from the steam car company. But as far as we can tell, they might have only produced maybe 100 or so actual automobiles. As far as I can tell, there's probably around 10 that still exist. Most of them are in Canadian museums. So an interesting car. You can imagine all the problems with having a steam car. One of my board members, who's a steam car enthusiast, always tells me if you don't like fire, you're not going to like a steam car. So you actually have an open flame with a big boiler. Depending on how cold it is, that's going to determine exactly how long it's going to take for your boiler to warm up to get enough steam to go. And I think we've all heard the term running out of steam. And so that aptly applies to steam cars as well. One of my favorite stories about this car is apparently there's a big hill in Stratford, and so when you went for a test drive, the gentleman who would take you out would try to convince you that even with the steam car you can make it up the steepest hill, and so apparently you would drive to the hill, then right before going up the hill, because he needed enough steam to build up in the boiler, it would go on quite a long rant, long explanation about the importance of this, that, and the other thing, would tell quite a long story just to buy time and then let you go up the hill. So a little bit of marketing in order to get enough steam to go up that hill. Steam cars are great. The one thing that they have that combustion engines don't have is they have all the power in the world right there. So as soon as you say go, you release that steam and you can go, accelerate extremely fast while you still have the power in the steam engine. So steam engines are great, but I think people just generally didn't like the whole idea of an open flame. It's something when you're on a locomotive or on a steamship, you're not quite aware of how the whole thing works. So I think passengers were probably fine, but in terms of daily maintenance, the danger of steam was a little too much for Canadians at the time. Another question we get is about driving at night, and our early cars have acetylene generators on them. So I just want to quickly point that out. If you go through the museum, you'll notice a lot of these sort of looks like a big kind of like a, I don't know, like a shell casing or something, a big brass shell casing that's on the running board of the cars. But these are actually the acetylene tanks. So acetylene tanks, basically they're full of calcium carbide, which kind of looks like white gravel if you ever have the chance to run across it. And basically if you add water to it, it's going to create a lot of heat in the form of a gas. So it's a type of chemical. When it gets wet, it releases a lot of heat. You've probably heard stories, I think, about particularly during like the First World War of ships going down, ships being struck by a torpedo, and suddenly the whole thing just erupts in fire as it goes underwater. And that's often because it was shipping acetylene or a similar chemical that was quite reactive to water. Now, in a small batch, that actually leads to a nice bit of gas that you can light on fire. And so instead of having the little carriage lamps that we're often familiar with that have kerosene or something like that in them, the acetylene is going to burn a little bit brighter. And so basically to get the acetylene going, you would add the water drip, which would start going, light the lamps on the front of the car, and you'd have one trip to get home with. The problem with acetylene is you can't turn it off. So once that chemical reaction starts, obviously you add water to get the flame going. You can't really add more water to stop it. So there's no way of stopping the chemical reaction. In terms of your night driving, you had one shot and you better time out being able to get back home before it was too late. Otherwise, you're going to quickly see that on all of these early cars, when you have the acetylene lamps, you're also going to have those kerosene lamps just in case you don't quite make it home on time. And so at the end of the night, the acetylene is going to burn out. It's basically going to leave like a white chalk substance that you're going to dispose of, but they're going to have to reset the entire system. So early on, driving at night was quite an elaborate process that even people in our car clubs would never imagine taking their vintage cars out at night. And so this is one of those technologies you often see on older vehicles. You often see the brass nicely restored, but it's very infrequent that any of the owners will actually fully get the whole system up and running to show off how acetylene lamps work. So just a little thing to look at from a Model T or another car of those periods. And obviously we're going to quickly replace, by the 1920s, electric car lamps. And here we have some from our Isotta Fraschini. So you can suddenly have bigger, brighter lamps, and technology went on from there. But you see quite a few examples in our collection of those early gas lamps. Now, if this was a year ago, we'd have a much more vibrant conversation about Ontario license plates. That was really the hot topic in February 2020, if you remember. So we have a lot of great examples of Ontario license plates. We have a fairly complete collection, actually. We don't have any prior to 1911. Prior to 1911, they didn't have metal or porcelain plates. They actually had leather badges that you put on your car. So one of the quick ways when you're identifying old photos that have cars in them, if there's no license plate, it's probably going to be sort of pre-1911. 1911 is the first year that we have porcelain plates. We just have them for 1 year here in Ontario. Here's an example from our collection of a fairly early number. But then from there, we're going to move into metal plates as well. And here in Ontario, up until last year, we actually had a very, very long run of sort of having the same license plate all the way since 1973, in fact. And I'm sure many of you are familiar. Prior to that, you got a new license plate every year. They changed colors and so forth. Here, the only change really for many, many years was our different slogan here. Keep it beautiful, to yours to discover. And then last year, here we have Minister Thompson came to the museum in 2020. This is one of our last public events, and gave us an honorary kind of first of the license plates that came off. And that, of course, has now turned into another very elaborate story that we're still documenting. So we're glad we got one for the collection, as it seems they might actually be a very short-lived license plate. So very nice to have. So what's the future of the automobile? I think I've seen a lot of memes on Facebook about the Jetsons, living in our COVID reality with telecommuting and, working from home and having meetings with your family over computers. We certainly don't have flying cars coming anytime soon, as far as I can tell. But we are getting smarter and smarter cars, and a lot of, concern about, technology, controlling the technology. This is certainly something our ancestors had in the early 20th century. People obviously had a lot of knowledge of horses. So, everyone knew how to talk to your horse. Everyone knew exactly how fast your horse went. Everyone knew when your horse was tired. Everyone knew when your horse was having a bad day. Well, you couldn't have that same level of communication with an automobile. And so here we are again in the 2020s, and I'm having these same conversations with people about, oh, my car, I know when it's having a bad day, I know when it's not working, I can kind of sense when it's not feeling right. What about all these new computer automated cars? How am I going to know? Is it going to give me a warning? How can I trust it? Having that kind of control issue. I just pulled this car cartoon. Do you know why my car pulled you over? I don't know. Having a bad day. So what's the expected future? Here in Oshawa, we still have a General Motors Engineering Center. Actually coming up in about May, they're actually opening a new test track for self-driving cars. So General Motors of Canada is investing heavily. Right now, we mostly think of Tesla as leading the pack in terms of self-driving technology, but General Motors of Canada is quickly catching up, and they actually have a self-driving test track. It's actually called the McLaughlin Test Track, and that's going to be opening for research in the next coming weeks. And I'm excited to go and see it. So hopefully they'll be turning out cars, and that conversation will continue. There's been a lot of announcements over the past year or so about various Canadian manufacturers looking to promote and build autonomous vehicles here in Canada. So it's definitely going to be something that's going to be part of our lives, and it's going to be interesting to see how that starts to roll out in the future. And a lot of it comes down to consumer trust and confidence, right? And so if I could see you all raise your hands, I could ask you, how many of you actually trust Google? How many of you trust Elon Musk and Tesla? Do you trust General Motors? Do you trust Google? I have lots of opinions on this. Obviously, sometimes these Zoom calls don't work, and the Zoom calls certainly aren't driving your vehicle around. So I think there's going to be a lot of PR and a lot of discussions about, consumer confidence in a lot of these features before they really hit the market and really become mainstream. But I think it'll be yet again another shift in terms of technology, and interestingly enough, sort of another phase. So I think that's about my time. So I will turn it over to questions, and you can ask me anything you want.